Hi, everybody. Here we are back again as the full team with Plus Three. Those of you who've been listening along, there's a deep dive into psychedelic capitalism, which I found to be fascinating. Today, however, we're going to go into another deep dive with our very own Nishay Deveneaux and her recent foray into YouTube with the video Rebel Wisdom and the psychedelic IDW, which I thoroughly enjoyed. We're going to talk a little bit about the work that Nishay has put together, but without digging too deep into it so that it doesn't spoil the video. We're going to talk around it, talk about some of the things that we're going to be doing in the future with regard to YouTube here at Symposia. We're an ongoing project. So thanks for being with us all. We've got Brian Norman here.
Hello.
We've got Dave Nichols.
Hey, hey.
And the star of the show, we've got Nishay Deveneaux.
Howdy.
So tell us a little bit about why you decided to make this video. What were you trying to do?
There's a bunch of different angles to that question. One of them being I'm now an unemployed academic and trying to find ways to do stuff outside of academia that's still kind of using analysis and interesting things and trying to branch out. But secondly, I got sucked down this rabbit hole of a strange corner of psychedelia that I feel like a lot of people, and as people have commented, some of the comments, a lot of people were not aware of. Probably to give some context, we should talk about Rebel Wisdom and the IDW just to give some definitional information. Yeah. Maybe do you want to jump in and say something about IDW?
Yeah. So, the intellectual dark web is this group that we actually have talked about briefly. I think we talked about it in the Lucy in the Sky with Nazis episode. They're a group of, people who are on YouTube, and they have podcasts, and some of them write books. They do public events, and they often share venues. They go on their own podcasts, but they present themselves as truth tellers and inconvenient fact discussers, sense makers. So we're talking about, for instance, Jordan Peterson or Eric Weinstein, who is the coiner of the term. The intellectual dark web. So for those who aren't familiar with the IDW, it's one of these things that I actually would say that the star is falling with the intellectual dark web. Some of them, they're an eclectic bunch. They tend to, resist any kind of efforts on the social justice warrior front. They're very critical of, PC culture. And they like to present themselves as, staunch defenders of free speech. So maybe even free speech as absolutists. A lot of them show up on, Dave Rubin's show. So that would be the IDW. Rebel Wisdom has been one of their major promoters. So yeah, that would be quick background on them, and then got
just
into
as a
Rebel
quick,
Wisdom. Yeah, sure.
Quick interjection on the IDW. I think they fall into what Normie has occasionally labeled folks as bad opinion havers.
I prefer radical centrists, but okay.
Fair enough. But I think it's worth pointing out that they engage in a lot of what we might call faux intellectualism, or this notion, they slap these labels on themselves as having these opinions or perspectives that are sort of too edgy for the mainstream, or too hot of a take. And the thing is, once you start unpacking the claims that are made, they engage in a lot of fallacious and really disingenuous tactics in order to support their positions, or rather, in order to retreat from positions that they can't actually support. So, you've got folks like atheist Richard Dawkins making statements about where he effectively calls for genocide, nuclear genocide. No? Am I...
Well, I believe we're like, let's back up here, because I think what you're referring to is Sam Harris.
Oh, sorry. Yes.
But in any case, I think we're getting too far away from the video, because the video, you spent a lot of time, Nishay, talking about Rebel Wisdom and a guy named Jamie Wheel, specifically some of his conversations with Douglas Rushkoff. So can you take us through a little bit of this?
Yeah, well, I feel like there needs to be more context linking the IDW to Rebel Wisdom specifically. And Dave, do you want to jump in?
Well, I just wanted to say, with the point about Sam Harris, and sorry, yes, you're absolutely correct. It was Sam Harris, not Dawkins. But you know, where there are these positions that get staked out that don't actually match up with either historical evidence, or the position isn't logically consistent the whole way through. And when that gets brought up, rather than engaging in a good faith, either retraction or acknowledgement of missteps, what we see is, in the case of Sam Harris, it was, oh, well, this was clearly a thought experiment, or this was clearly a joke, and as you actually pick through it, it doesn't hold up. It doesn't hold up to scrutiny. And so these are folks who seem to want attention. These are folks who seem to want engagement with themselves as speakers or intellectuals, but then when you actually attempt to hold their feet to the fire, they're not willing to stick it out based on the intellectual merits or lack thereof of the positions. And I think that's the point that I would like to highlight around the IDW and some of those tactics, is that if this is going to be a discussion, particularly about ideas that are potentially too hot to handle, then we need to actually stick with the ideas and go through them. And if those ideas don't hold up, well, then there's not really a case to be made for any sort of intellectualism in this dark web.
Yeah,
to tie that in a little bit to the Rebel Wisdom stuff, you know, we've seen some rather interesting positions or responses staked out when, and we'll get into this a little bit deeper, but as Nishay started pointing to some of the meat and potatoes arguments getting elucidated, say Douglas Rushkoff and Jamie Wheel, and as we lay the actual arguments on the table and the intellectual content, suddenly we see a retreating from the content, or we see oh, well, you just don't understand this person. They're actually quite sweet, or, well, you have to understand, in the case, Jamie Wheel came onto YouTube and said, actually, you've made me into a bit of a straw man, and Douglas Rushkoff and I agree on many things, except that in that comment, he didn't give any specifics. He didn't say what Nishay had, at what point she had turned him into a straw man. He didn't indicate a willingness to engage around the points where he and Rushkoff clearly disagreed, even when he was asked to name those specifics. So I don't want to get too far down that rabbit hole.
I want to clarify, because we had Douglas Rushkoff on an episode just recently, but I don't think we've done a good job of introducing Jamie Wheel here. We should be fair to fans. So maybe you could tell us who he is.
This is still a little chaotic, but I think we still need to, before getting to Jamie even, explain Rebel Wisdom, because I
think you're best situated to do so.
So I actually first started watching Rebel Wisdom over a year ago when they were doing conversations around Jordan Peterson. And Jordan Peterson, I'm actually working right now on another video looking at similarities between Jordan Peterson's ideas about psychology with Carlos Castaneda, because they're very similar. The kind of clean your room and living like a warrior is like virtually mapped on. And what I find interesting with both of those figures is that they have actual real benefit to people, and they're really controversial. And when you only focus on one side of that, you end up in this sort of polarized, you know, he said, she said, oh, they're all bad, oh, they're all good kind of conversations. And there is genuinely some on the left kind of fantastical knee-jerk, you know, reactions away from some of the IDW figures that are kind of based on imaginary boogeyman versions of those people. And so I'm interested in how Rebel Wisdom, you know, they wanted to, they're really, you know, connected to the psychedelic community in some ways. One of the co-founders was involved with Breaking Convention in the UK. And I really respected their nuanced take, their attempt to kind of grapple with some of the issues in a way that wasn't just demonizing, you know, these figures, because there was benefit. Like people like Jordan Peterson will say, people constantly come up to him and say how much his work has helped them. So we need to kind of acknowledge that while saying some of his ideas are bogus, you know? And so
I liken some of these IDW folks to the pickup artist community. So I don't know if anybody is familiar with this thing they did. This is on reality TV, so like don't look at me that weird. But like the pickup artist community basically said, you know, oh, we're gonna do a bunch of male empowerment kind of stuff where we say, hey, you know, maybe you should do some basic hygiene and work out, and I don't know, learn how to talk to people. But then they coupled it with a bunch of like toxic bullshit. So in some ways, that's one of the struggles of criticizing anything that's going on the intellectual dark web, because it is mixed up with some pretty helpful self-help stuff if you haven't heard that. And then there are these sort of Trojan horses that are slipped in my opinion.
Yeah, and in the year basically since I saw that kind of like early take and then recent work, it seems like from my, you know, viewing that the folks at Rebel Wisdom, including David Fuller, who's the main interviewer, he comes from in a career in broadcast journalism. He worked for the BBC, et cetera. So he's kind of moved from that world to this new kind of Joe Rogan opened up, you know, the podcast and the alt media landscape. And it seems like in that year since I first came across these kind of interested takes, they've actually become quite enamored with some of these IDW figures in a way that I found surprising. I mean, on the one hand, and I mentioned this in the video, you could understand on some level why some people in the psychedelic community would be drawn to these figures, because they're kind of anti kind of what everyone else is doing, kind of think for yourself rhetoric, question established assumptions about the way things are. But they also pack in all, like the Trojan horse, I think is a great metaphor for it, because I think there are these very conservative issues. But nonetheless, I saw, you know, I was on YouTube and I saw that had this pop-up of, oh, you know, streaming live, Doug Rushkoff speaking with Jamie Wheal. And we had just, you know, a few months ago had Doug on the show, and I knew Jamie Wheal as one of the co-authors of Stealing Fire, and that has a long subtitle about, you know, how military elite. And oh yeah,
it's like
do you know?
Elite Performance and
yeah,
you know, I actually
so athletes, military, yeah. And there's one other one, but he's, you know, how these groups are marshaling altered states and insights to
tech entrepreneurs.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, to basically like level up. It's this ultimate, you know, self development entrepreneur, you know, he even talks about, you know, in one interview talking about getting, you know, 1% performing CEO to being like a 0.01% right. CEO based on cultivating flow states and stuff like that.
It's so the full title, just for accuracy here, is Stealing Fire: How Silicon Valley, the Navy SEALs, and maverick scientists are revolutionizing the way we live and work.
Yeah. Yeah, and I actually, in an article I published in 2018 on Timothy Leary, I had kind of footnoted the existence of this book because to me it was a completely, you know, capitalistic version of, you know, this kind of self-help that we've seen in the years since actually flourishing with the Goop kind of model of psychedelic use. And so I positioned it as like counter to what I was interested in my article. And so I saw, you know, this live conversation happening, and I hopped on, and it was so strange because it just seemed, and I mentioned this in the video, it seemed like Doug and Jamie were actually coming at their ideas from like completely different perspectives, but they were like seemingly agreeing. And what Jamie was saying about, you know, just the barriers to social change was kind of like what the topic of the video. It just seemed so at odds with my own experience. And so I ended up just following this breadcrumb essentially into this weird rabbit hole of other videos, and then basically felt like I needed to let other people know about the strange world I had found.
Yeah. I mean, so, you know, not to over summarize, but I mean, Wheel was talking about, apex predators and peak performers, these in these rather general terms, alpha types, leaders, that kind of thing. And Rushkoff was critiquing that, right? He was saying we don't need, go on.
Yeah, we don't, the way to change the world isn't by, becoming the superhero that, gets all the right tech CEOs to make the new platform and, lead to the green future. He's saying that, act locally, individually. Don't try to have this abstracting impulse where you kind of get outside of lived reality and try to enforce some system on everybody. And meanwhile, go ahead, Dave.
Well, I was going to say, I think that this is an arena that we come up against frequently within psychedelia, and the notion that we need better psychedelic leaders. And I actually think we need to get away from the notion of leaders. I think if we actually look at our own lives, I believe you'd be hard pressed to find people who think there are people outside of them who are better equipped to make the decisions about how they should live their lives. And so this notion that we need to be vesting our interests and our understandings and our actions into groups or institutions or structures that these other people have set up in order to lead us into some bright future that they and their co-collaborators have envisioned for us. And if we just cede them our agency and our autonomy and our visions for what we'd like, and trust that they have our best intentions at heart, I think it just doesn't hold, and I think if we actually examine the kind of dynamics that requires, it's sort of inherently coercive. And the second thing that really seems to move in parallel with that is this notion that there is a single solution that can scale. Right? This notion that we can map it out here and we can generalize it and we can, this particular solution and this prescription, and if we can just get it big enough and distributed enough to the entirety of humanity or cross-culturally, this will bring about massive revolutionary change. And I would suggest that if we look at dynamics of colonialism, we can see exactly that mentality. We see, if we look at certain ethnobotanical histories, if we look at, say, amaranth, and I think it was the Spanish conquistadors coming into South America and recognizing that amaranth was functioning not only as a food staple, but also as a religious or spiritual plant, right? And attempting to completely obliterate its function in society. And suddenly you have a lack of the vitamins that are coming from the plant. You start having birth defects, spina bifida, all of these other things, right? We see the disruption when somebody says, no, we have your best interests. Well, we have our best interests at heart, and we're going to map those onto your society. We see that also with rice paddy farming. These notions of we have a singular scale, we have a singular solution that we can map over societies, irrespective of how those societies function, what they need. We have decided that we are the decision makers.
Yeah, and we're seeing that with everything, cryptocurrency, the internet, same things. I think Doug's point that he makes is like that we don't need to create this, like, he uses scaled golem to like
I like that.
to fight these other problems that were already created through
by the
scaled
same thing.
solutions.
Yeah, exactly.
And when I found it funny listening to Jamie on, say, Rebel Wisdom, then versus the other clip that you played when he's in full business mode. He's in like full, that full kind of
he's code
mode.
Switched at that point into entrepreneur mode.
Totally. And like, to me, he's like this kind of like, he's this novel psychedelic guru guy who can like speak corporate language in like a really confident way. Like put Terrence McKenna, like, flank him with like UFC fighters and get a Navy SEAL or two. And then now you got your like confident warrior guru guy. Mm-hmm. That's kind of like this sort of Hollywood type thing. You could get and you're seeing this happen with like that group that's out there, unlimited sciences. This is the strategy that they're pursuing. You get your UFC fighter, you get your like ex-military sniper, and throw the psychedelic language in there, and now you've got this like Rogan sellable psychedelic kind of product there.
Well, the whole
yeah.
peak performance narrative. So, I mean, what's his name?
Optimize.
Well, so Wheel talks about flow states. That's his whole shtick. He has the flow dojo, and
mapping the genome of flow. I think
the flow genome project. Where flow states are these particular kind of Zen transcendent, but very work friendly states that bring elite killing squads. Oh, I'm sorry, like super soldier, or what are we talking about? Like Marines together to where they're communicating without words in a very bromantic way, like as they invade other countries for capitalistic goals. But like I'm sorry, I'm being really uncharitable. But the idea of the
are we supposed to be charitable to the military?
I don't know. So that's my sort of gut reaction to kind of this stuff, is that we have these like aspirational figures out there who are clearly like peak performers. You're not a peak performer. You're just a dude on the couch, and this is a very common kind of emotional manipulation advertising technique where we put people out front who are aspirational. And then we say, if you get, the blue program, will tell you the basics of flow. If you get the elite, plaid paisley gold membership, we will take you on a flow retreat that will change your, marriage or whatever.
And if you're a C-suite exec with $5,000 to drop on an Inside the Guru seminar, well, then you can get some real time, unlock the true secrets of flow, and get a fully mapped flow genome.
6 figures, baby.
And so it's also want to combine this. We mentioned this impulse is, you mentioned blockchain, et cetera, is happening elsewhere. But what's really interesting about the psychedelic kind of manifestation of this is that you're combining all of these dynamics that we were just talking about with these, like, the ultra rich coming to Burning Man, having these far out, psychedelic experiences, and suddenly being like, whoa, all of my upbringing brought me to this moment, and now I have all this money, and I'm here because I'm supposed to be this person who does the scaled golem. That's literally, there's this, you're merging the messianic kind of impulse that comes with some psychedelic experience with this kind of tapping into the flow and becoming one with the group. And so you end up having Jamie basically coaching these rich psychedelic folks in a way that is promoting them as the solution.
We'll sprinkle a little meritocracy on top of the whole mix, right? Like
Right.
this notion, and as much as you talk about
peak
rich folks
performers.
going, right, as much as you talk about rich folks going to Burning Man, then there's also Burning Man being brought to the rich folks at events like Davos and the world's largest cacao ceremony being held.
Yeah, let's
Hey,
talk
we're
about that
gonna-
real quick, because I mean, they're like, wait, we're talking about Jamie Wheel, we're talking about the IDW. What the fuck does this have to deal with psychedelics? One of the things I noticed in your video is the quotes from a man we haven't introduced yet, which would be Lucian, which we'll talk about. Is that no one ever directly speaks about psychedelics, but we're going to talk about cacao and consciousness and
having a company called
dinners.
Brave New, and
Yes.
referring to Huxley and referring to Ram Dass and all of these figures.
But no mention of what clearly is going on is some kind of like, elite, let's take drugs at Davos kind of thing, which sounds, by the way, terrible. But take us through this, Nishay.
Well, they did a ceremony with Rick Doblin of MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association.
Did
for
he get his
Psychedelic Studies.
psychedelic therapy license yet to do that?
I don't think you need a license at Davos. I think
Okay.
No, for cacao, cacao has become one of the very common, cacao and combo are two things that it seems have proliferated in part due to the fact that people feel comfortable sharing and propagating ceremony around it without much, if any, experience. So I imagine Cacao could be presented as, hey, this isn't really going to be much of an experience, so we can do this, and we're sort of paying an homage to this whole body of more profound things. But look, this might actually fit the sort of business container.
Yeah, and like
of Davos.
people are okay with like chocolate, you know, so it's like it's very accessible to, you know, the average person.
So perhaps I misspoke earlier, but I mean, I spent a good deal of time in Latin America, and when I have seen cacao ceremonies advertised, usually what's being advertised is a mushroom experience as well. So who knows if that's actually what was going on at Davos.
If you were at that Davos ceremony, let us know. We're curious to find out.
Send us an email.
But so Doblin was there as like one of these like selected speakers to basically cast a vision for 2030. This is like envisioning a world that has become fixed of all of its ills and problems. And, you know, there's a lot of rhetoric around, you know, manifesting through visualization and stuff like that. And so that whole scene is going on at Davos. And Davos, we have mentioned before, is like this annual rich man's festival, essentially, where the billionaires
Davos
come in with their private jets. And go ahead.
The World Economic Forum is what happens in the town of Davos, Switzerland. It's invite only.
Yeah, so you know, that's where this ceremony was happening in the visualization.
So I mean,
tell us about Lucian and how did you find Lucian?
Well, so Jamie basically was describing these rich, turned on, you know, psychedelic folks that have like a lot of power, a lot of, you know, ability to do stuff, and they just, as he says, they cannot get the thing done. There is some problem happening interpersonally, and he describes it as the IDW really loves game theory, you know, this kind of like mathematical, ruthless approach to modeling interpersonal behavior and dynamics. And so the idea is that you have, you know, people who are on the same page, want the same things, but then they see a glimmer in someone's eye and they suddenly realize like, maybe that person's out for themselves. They wanted to be first author on the paper. They wanted to have their name at the top of the podcast or whatever, you know. And then he was saying that even if that person isn't really sociopathic, the fear that other people might not be truly in it authentically means that every individual person is incentivized to become selfish and try to take all the power for themselves. And I was listening to this and I was just like, what kinds of group dynamics is this guy used to working in? I was thinking about working with you guys on Symposium, you know, the rest of the team, and it is the polar opposite where it's like everyone just like helps each other, supports each other. There's never an instance where like, Dave, you seemed really, you know, evil that day, and like, you know, it's just like that never happens. And
well,
so,
maybe Dave has the orca brain with all the folds in it.
Yeah.
That's right.
He's a cooperative apex predator.
That's right.
Well, yeah. but the question you just raised, what kind of social groups is he participating in? We know, right? It's Goldman Sachs.
Well, he named we'll go the different companies, and then he named where these people are coming from. He said Davos, he said Burning Man. You know, he was listing these specific, you know, in addition to all of his,
management consulting, you know,
his resume is online, and there's like a, you know, an amazing list of companies, you know, top companies that hire him for consulting fees and stuff. So, but
you know, I want to say real quick, which is great, you know, but what we see so often, and you get into this in your video, is that like, okay, so like these people at the top of their financial game, these plutocrats, you know, they have inherited wealth and they've made more wealth through what, you know, we're gonna make an app that puts your dad out of business and replaces them with a robot. And now I've got $1 million or something. So these individuals, like, you know, like, okay, you can have that resume. You can be one of the kingpins and rulers of the world, masters of the universe. But they also want to be seen as like, moral Promethean individuals who are just bequeathing upon us a better world. And as Dave has talked about on more than one occasion, like you can't really have it both ways when you're playing the power game and the pyramid game, as Rushkoff mentioned it, in that episode. If you're building a pyramid and you want to sit on top of it, you don't also get to talk about like the liberatory struggle, because you could just like step off the necks of your underlings, and we'd be in a different situation, So that was one thing I wanted to mention.
And so with this Lucian character,
who by all accounts is quite nice as a person. So this is not like, everyone who I've spoken to who knows him says he really means well and he's a great guy. But unfortunately, he served the example of the kind of person that I was looking for.
Sure.
Yeah, well, it's cool that he's stopping in. Who
is he again? Who is he?
He's someone who's stopping in now from 2030.
Right. Yeah, he's come back.
That's what he says. That's what he says on his Twitter.
Yeah, but he comes from the European aristocracy, from Poland, and I think he lived in England. So like multiple, inheritance lines of, extreme titles and wealth that he's inherited. And he's then become a, CEO of first Brave New and then Brave New Talent, which as Pace was kind of jokingly referring to, they were making money off of essentially moving things towards the gig economy and finding ways of getting workers that are good for the moment that you don't have to stick with, and then moving on, which is great for companies, looking for bottom line costs, but is terrible for people. Speaking as someone who's been applying for adjunct jobs, like you can't like settle down and do stuff if you're constantly trying to get the next gig.
And this is a concept that economists like Alan Greenspan and other, vaunted figures of liberal economics have been hailed for saying, pointing to the merits of precarious workforces, because when you have a precarious workforce, it's good for business. It means your employees are going to be more docile when they can't unionize, when they know that they might be fired at will, when they know that their job isn't guaranteed. This makes people fall in line and eat pay cuts, eat all sorts of abusive behaviors from management. Those dynamics run in a certain way. They benefit a certain order. And when we talk about folks like Lucian, who I have no evidence to indicate that he's anything other than a pleasant person from a social and interpersonal relations point, and that's all well and good, but that's not the entirety of who he is and the position he takes in the world. And this goes to this long-standing notion of people who see themselves as being socially liberal and fiscally conservative.
Yeah, which he Wheel identifies himself as in a clip that I didn't include in the video.
Yeah. Gotcha. Yeah. And so, looking at that, the material effects of what these people do are real. These have consequences. These impact people all around the world. And, in cases of, say the gigification of economics, this puts people in really terrible positions. And when we look at the US, when we see what's going on right now in the context of pandemic, in the context of housing, in the context of people who are already living paycheck to paycheck or working multiple jobs and still barely making the poverty line, if that, the notion of people who are contributing to these economic realities being quote unquote good people because they're nice or because they're kind when you meet them at some sort of social event, that really doesn't tell the full story. And especially as we see these corporate heads come rushing into the space, and we have all sorts of folks who want to play guru to the corporate executives, by all means, listen to the things they say, and please look at the things they've said over a much longer scope than what they've said in the last couple of years, but also look at what they've done and look at how those actions play out in the real world, because that's all part of who they are and what they do. So in the case of Lucian, I think it's quite telling, not only as far as his history, but then looking at some of the structures that he's currently in the process of engaging with. Which,
You mean what are these neo-Masonic lodges?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah, he said that. Yeah,
that was one of the
Well-
things about your video that I have to commend you, because you really know how to keep a straight face when people are laying down some pretty nutty assertions. Like, how did you not giggle while these
Well,
things were being
I mean, I remember like messaging you guys when I found Lucian, because I was like, it's real, like these people exist. Like I was I was really just kind of shocked ultimately, and I think that might have, you know, helped me to keep it together,
mean,
connecting it.
I've been studying climate for 10 years, but I never really heard that the solution for climate change is taking blood oaths in secret societies, you know?
Yeah, well, so it's this interesting mix between this meritocratic kind of idea with this messianic, well, like we are here now to do this thing as this group that we've found ourselves amongst. And so he's transitioned to like this new project called Savannah House in San Francisco. They bought, like, it was the house of the guy who created the bridge, and has like some
the
huge
Golden Gate Bridge.
Golden Gate Bridge.
Yeah, and has some huge dining table. And so basically like holding these salons and, you know, trying to connect these, you know, psychedelic superhero types that are going to be kind of leading us into this new Game B reality. And we haven't even touched on the Game A, Game B thing, which I feel like is worth,
I think we need to get
doing.
there. I do want to say this though. We have, and I'm probably the worst perpetrator in this episode right here. I've talked somewhat disdainfully about like these like elite plutocrats, which you refer to them clearly in your video as. But I just want to make it clear that, you know, the clips that you used in this video, they were like from Davos. So the projects being described, they're not like our opinion that they are an elite strategy for collective liberation, but it's like these are the global elite meeting at the global elite meeting, talking about how their consciousness and their network is crucial to saving the world. Does that sound accurate to you?
No, yeah, absolutely. That we're seeing, this is what's happening. You know, it's one facet of psychedelic mainstreaming, that it's making its way to the financial elites, and that they are finding ways of adapting their current power, you know, situation to this liberatory psychedelic moment that they're kind of identifying. And oh, go ahead.
Please, no, you.
No,
I would just say the shorthand of what I think is going on is these people have gotten together and decided that they like the smell of their farts a little bit too much.
Well, and one of the things that stood out to me, and I have to say, I also commend you, Nishay, on being able to keep a straight face. For me, it was less about laughing and more about almost like chewing through my tongue as I listened to Lucian engage in the most interesting gobbledygook word salad in interviews, where the interviewer would, with a straight face, ask questions about what they were up to, receive answers that, yes, were chock full of words, but when you unpack those words, there was no meaning there. There was no actual material project towards the ends that he was ostensibly claiming to be pursuing.
That's unfair. There was a material project discussed, and he discussed a material object, which was a 60 person dinner table.
Yeah, because it's like, from this perspective, it's a matter of having more parties with the cool people to get the job done.
Is there any other group that's doing that right now?
There is, and we'll come back to that in a sec. But before we do, because we've highlighted the Game A, Game B thing a few times, I just want to bring back.
Naughty.
So So one of the things that Wheel points out or raises in this, and I think he uses a big cat analogy of like, oh, all of these sort of psychedelic superheroes are the kind of people that you have to make sure their enclosure has enough space for them to roam.
Well, they're
and
used
hunt.
to needing like a certain hundreds of acres on their own, and so they don't naturally play well together.
Which I think is really interesting, because when people start telling you the world is like this and things are like this, they're not, they may believe they're making some sort of objective statement about reality, but really what they're doing is telling you a whole lot about themselves, how they see the world, who they engage with, and what they're familiar with.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, thinking about this sort of question of game A, game B, are we engaged in cooperative, collaborative dynamics? Are we engaged in competitive, more, I think as he puts it, sort of egoist dynamics? I think something to point out, again, with that issue of scaling is this notion of one size fits, this notion that there is only game A and game B and everything reduces to either game A or game B.
I think we need to back up, because seriously, when I first started hearing this stuff, this stuff, I was like, what are we talking about here? This seems like intentional obfuscation, you know?
And I mean, Rebel Wisdom, for anyone who really wants to go deeper into some of this stuff, has a whole like series on the history of like game A, game B, like the verbiage behind it. But just in shorthand form, the idea is that we've been living under game A dynamics, which are kind of ruthless, race to the bottom, cutthroat competition. And the key to moving forward with the world in a non-destructive way will be shifting intentionally from game A to game B dynamics, which are based on mutual trust and cooperation.
But so I'm currently on the Game B wiki, and I just want to make sure that we're all clear that Game B is the flag on the hill for an omni-win civilization that maximizes human flourishing.
Omni-win?
Yeah.
That's a really funny wording.
It's also a meta protocol for hyper collaboration.
What language is this?
It must orient primary innovation capacity towards cultivating individual and collective sovereignty. And it must foster awareness of how choices show up and are decided more than it augments individual and collective power. Do you follow? That's where we're going. We're going to game B here.
That's like some libertarian Burning Man.
Yeah,
speech.
no, that's exactly like what it is this, that, this emphasis on sovereignty, individual rights, and like, that's completely behind like all of the IDW stuff, the idea that we're going to need to freely agree to cooperate and kind of convince people to agree in a certain way to move into this game B orientation.
Right. So like, just to like, I think maybe a better distillation is this last bit. It just says, a game B system is any cooperative, mutually beneficial system that can outcompete exploitative adversarial systems through manifest appeal and willful voluntary participation.
Yeah, so
are they talking about socialism here? Because that sounds a lot like socialism.
No. Okay, I have to know the specific example that's going on with Lucian. Okay. Is that we're having this 2030 envisioning, and to like basically to be cool and get invited to the best parties at Burning Man, this is the kind of the logic behind it. You need to be able to say what you did to help bring about the 2030 utopia. And so therefore it's like people acting in their selfish interest to want to go to that, be invited to that best party, have to do something that is good for the planet, good for game B dynamics. And so it's a way of trying to basically hijack selfish motives in a way that ends up being kind of universally beneficial.
Right.
And this is something I wanted to say about the omni-winning of game B is that, right, this is this notion that we can all win together. This is the win-win-win, or this is the triple bottom line that you'll hear some people talk about, where what they mean is they actually don't want to change anything from how it is now. They just want to imagine a situation in which the people who are kneeling on other people's necks and the people whose necks they're kneeling on can win together. We don't actually need to change the structures and the relationships between those people. We can imagine some sort of world where, contradictory though it may be, somehow this rising tide lifts all boats.
Yeah.
And the thing is, it's bullshit. Like when you actually start picking it apart, number one, the notion that people on the top of sort of capitalist pyramid schemes are have any interest beyond their own survival at the point where we've seen whether we look ecologically, whether we look socially, sure, their survival is tied to planetary survival. Sure, their survival is tied to social dynamics, as Doug Rushkoff brings up in his Survival of the Richest piece.
Yeah,
when he's there talking with some of the world's richest people who have paid him to come out and tell them how they can fortify their bunkers and what sort of strategies.
Keep their guards loyal.
Who should have the key to their food stores, right? How do they stop their guards from revolting? He says, maybe you should look at contributing to social configurations in the here and now that make people less likely to bring torches and pitchforks for you when the whole thing comes crashing down, as we all know it will. Because he points out that none of them have some question as to whether it's going to happen. It's just when it's going to happen. And he explains that all of them were highly resistant to the idea that A, things could be changed, and that B, despite the fact that they were some of the most powerful, most rich people in the world, that they were capable of affecting any change to that end.
So do you think Douglas Rushkoff would be invited to this party if he said that, he instilled brotherly love and, started one big union and that kind of thing, that workers were treated well and had control over their daily lives and production and that sort of thing?
My suspicion is that somebody would nod their head, tell him, thank you for contributing to this beautiful moment, invite him into the fold, and essentially try to talk past the content.
Well, that's in fact what the video that you pointed out, Nishay,
yeah,
that occurred.
Tell us about that.
Well, Norman, what were you talking about in the video?
I mean, they were all sitting around the table, and there was a woman who voiced her concerns, right?
Right. Yeah, because I basically, because of COVID, some of their salons have gone online, and they had this specific salon where they were trying to create a charter, the unanimous charter that they were actually planning to present at the UN, to take this document. And there was a draft created by this person, Ram, who is a mysticpreneur by his title on his website. He's also the author of a book on how Michael Jackson is a spiritual icon, which I find very interesting when you think about, other alleged stuff that Michael Jackson was involved with. And it seems symptomatic of this whole, putting people on a pedestal and ignoring the questionable stuff that they're doing. It seemed, kind of like a red flag to me as it was. But this person during the call tried to say, maybe we should be focusing on our own stuff, which, includes this desire to be the scaled column that's going to fix everything. And I just found both Ram and Lucian's response to her very telling, in the sense that there was no even a momentary kind of questioning of is there anything in what this person said that was not included in our thing? It was immediately, you might not have liked the words, you might not have liked but it was there. You might not have realized it. You might have
a lot of flattery too.
I was going to say, there was
quite a bit of flattery.
There was that ingratitude.
Gratitude for the words. And this, I want to say, that the dining room table with all the people collected around it, this sort of multi-stakeholder, shareholder, whatever meeting, plus that sort of gratitude.
Catered meal, only for the people who were there.
Now, Pace, you pointed out not too long ago that there are other people also engaged in these sorts of multi-stakeholder dinners. And I would point out that they're also engaged in a whole lot of gratitude for critical perspectives, even while they say the status quo is as it is, and we're not going to be able to change that. And
Sure.
that's North Star.
That's North Star.
Well, and North Star, I mean, part of what Jamie, because I spoke already about, how do we get these Panthers to play well together? He comes up with this idea of, basically a code of ethics that you kind of spiritually identify with, where
you take a blood oath.
Yeah, exactly. Where you trust that everyone in that space, and so instead of saying, oh, I saw in Dave's eye that evil sparkle, you remind yourself, we have all promised each other that we are on side, working towards the same goal. And that's enough. And North Star has the same kind of faith in bureaucratic agreements, it seems like, of an oath of good behavior as being the thing that will save us in the future.
So North Star is, and I think we're going to do some future work on them, but just so that we're clear, North Star is a group that has put forth an ethical pledge for actors in the psychedelic space.
They not
particularly
they call themselves, don't they call themselves the ethical like watchdog?
No, they claim to be an ethical trade organization.
Yeah,
and
but they
say
position
that
themselves as like the ethical trade organization for psychedelics is what I recall.
Yeah,
well they try to parse around that, because they both talk about some stage at which, they acknowledge they have no teeth. They acknowledge they're not looking to enforce the pledge that they're having people sign, that this is more to get people to reflect on things. But then they make these statements about at some point down the line, and they say, we haven't decided we're going to do this. We haven't decided that we'll be a membership organization where we'll actually function as a ethical trade organization. But when we get to the point where we do that, then we can discuss what that looks like. And so there's these really interesting dynamics around that sort of rubber stamping of participation that you brought up, Nishay, with these sort of invites to cooperate, collaborate. Sorry, Pace.
Well, so I want to be fair to our listeners and just read at least the bullet points of the North Star Ethics Pledge. And it seems like they've edited this, unless I'm mistaken. We've got seven points here, but in any case, I could be wrong. I'm often wrong. The principles are: 1, start within; 2, study the traditions; 3, build trust; 4, consider the gravity; 5, focus on process; 6, create equality and justice; and 7, pay it forward. And this here, you can sign and have a commitment, your name, your organization, how you identify, or what have you. And yeah, once we do that, the psychedelic field will just not have the kinds of predatory, problems and externalities and exploitative relationships that maybe we saw in the cannabis industry. We're certainly not.
In the interest of being fair, they don't go that far. They don't say that this is actually going to resolve anything.
What do they say it's going to do again?
The hope is that, as I understand it, the way they present it is that it will cause people to reflect on their values and what they want to do, and that will somehow make things better. Now, I think, to my mind, this quite clearly presents a sort of corporate whitewash, where you sign on to the pledge, or you say you're committed to the pledge, and then you march forward, and supposedly you are more focused on ethics, and this improves the ethical engagement of the community. Now, never mind that there's already problematic people that have signed this pledge, but beyond that, if we actually look at, the founder of North Star has said that the status quo is here to stay, that this is not getting changed. And if we think about the status quo of capitalism, there, as you've pointed out repeatedly, Pace, there is no ethical consumption under capitalism. The notion of an ethical map or an ethical pledge that's somehow going to improve ethical behavior within the dynamics of status quo systems doesn't actually hold, to my mind. Furthermore, it creates this sense of ethics where ethics stops being understood as systems tied to moral understandings and complex, messy discussions about human social relations and behavior and what is and is not moral and how do we set up structures around that. And instead, ethics becomes seen as some sort of prescriptive rules, right?
Yeah,
Even though they're saying, sorry, go ahead.
I mean, I'll just be blunt. I know PR when I see it. I used to work in the industry. Second of all, I'm not sure what the value of ethics that you sacrifice nothing for, or would be willing to sacrifice nothing for, have. That's not an ethical paradigm that I'm familiar with. You know, vegans will be all kinds of, you know, annoying. Will leave the table. Will request special, you know, things. Not to crack on vegans. I mean, maybe a little. I was vegan for a while, by the way. Vegans hate it when you say that. But anyway, like, here's the thing. Like, the point is that ethics that don't cost you anything are worthless. And this pledge costs nobody anything. And I'm just going to say, like, I was in their public Zoom in the breakout session that was entitled Growing Teeth. And I will say that from my just very rough eye on the time, we literally spent more time discussing carrots than we did the other analogy for teeth, which would be sticks. There were no teeth, which in my understanding of biology are that which wounds and kills, maims, tears, consumes. I don't think there's any willingness on the part of North Star to hold anyone accountable in the psychedelic space.
And these are the same structural issues that we see with Jamie Wheal and with Lucian. Sorry, I'm spacing on his last name, Tarnowski.
Tarnowski, yeah.
Where there's this stated desire to change things. There's an articulation that things are not working, never mind if they were actually constructed to function in this way. And some vague sense that things need to change, but there's no real skin in the game. There's no willingness to actually engage in the difficult work of opposing dominant culture, of opposing the death, destruction, abuse, coercion that comes with these really existing systems. And the thing is, there are penalties for action. There are
if you put what you just said on a business card, you're never going to get a consulting contract ever. You know,
precisely. And I've turned down
website.
Consulting. Well, with what you say about costs, you know, I and we have turned down consulting opportunities based on, in part, on our mapping of the corporadelic space, where people recognize that there is a huge value to having the kind of insight and web and understanding of who these businesses are, what they're up to, and that gives a strategic economic corporate edge if you have that web of insight.
Yeah,
and for us.
I want to talk about this. I also want to get back to the video because I have a feeling that we veered off into territory that we'll probably explore later. But Nishay, like,
was there one thing that you wanted to connect it to, or
I was just trying to bring it back, point out that that lack of willingness for penalties, you know, or to acknowledge the real world's effects of actions, ties into a third component that we've discussed around some of these issues and around questions of platforming and what does real change look like and what are the consequences of actions. And some of the people who position themselves as these psychedelic elite and leaders, Daniel Pinchbeck, right? And the fact that even though he engaged in actions for which there were pretty bullshit consequences, where it took a whole hell of a lot of pressure to get certain people to recognize what he had done, what he had admitted to doing, that even with that, he's still trying to craft himself as one of these gatekeepers. And he may not be running in the exact same circles as Wheal or Tarnowski, but again, this is somebody who is giving a lot of lip service to these dialogues of leading some sort of change of consciousness. And so I was trying to bring it back to the video stuff and tie in that character who had come up in some of our pre-recording discussions.
Yeah, I mean, and Pinchbeck, who we've put a statement out about, like, he's used the pandemic as a way in terms of like these, the myth building that Doug was warning about, rather than, stepping away from the same messianic power, centralizing impulse that led to his kind of indiscretions and abuses of, women earlier that he's acknowledged. Rather than step away from that, he's re-seized the opportunity to center himself and said, in fact, I was right about 2012, might have been off by a few years, but all of that was actually true. And the fact that I have acknowledged these indiscretions and learned from them makes me an expert that now you pay for my online class, even though he's seizing the same dynamics and he's yet to actually repair all of the damage that he has done in those earlier stages. Now he is the expert and profiting off of that exploitation of women, which I just find, it's just illustrative of the problem with that messianic impulse by these psychedelic leaders, so-called.
Yeah, I mean, by all accounts, he's composting the harms that he's done to others. He uses that language. In any case, I mean, this centering and just as you've talked about in the video of the narcissistic and or sociopathic traits, where it doesn't matter what happens, like this whole movement needs a leader and I'm one of them. I mean, I think that speaks to who, for instance, Jamie Wheal is hanging out with, in the sense that, these are people who don't have an identity if they don't have 10 underlings. And so, like this is kind of what he's referring to when he says, like, these people are jaguars who require 4 acres of space each, and how do we get us to work together? I'm not very sure that any of these people work very much at all. I think most of their their websites and their books are taken care of by their assistants and underlings, and they spend the rest of their day eating lunch and doing push-ups. Just my 2 cents.
Well, and it's also, sorry, Nishay, were you gonna?
No, you go for it. So
the webs of support that these people require, right? The fact that it's not that, say, the people who've reached out in defense of Wheal or to say that Lucian is such a great guy or all of these things. Again, it's folks who are willing to do that reputational whitewashing. It's folks who are willing to step up and say, actually, no, these folks are fine. These people belong here. Their perspectives deserve platforming and engagement, and they're adding to the discourse. And yet we also see, a lack of willingness to state those difficult observations, right? We see an unwillingness to really put skin in the game and say, in the case of Pinchbeck, how many people kept their silence around him? I mean, I don't know. I'm not sure to what extent Ken Jordan over at Lucid News and before that at Reality Sandwich has ever acknowledged what his co-founder has done in a public way, has ever talked to that, has ever been willing to say, like, there's no debate about this. This is stuff that Pinchbeck has admitted to and has put out there, and I'm actually not okay with it. And if we have these sort of circles of, if not complicity, at least implicit support, and a willingness to allow these psychedelic jaguars or whatever we want to call them to continue to operate and continue to stake out these territories, right? Then we find ourselves on a terrain with a hell of a lot of predators. Yeah. And that doesn't make me feel particularly, I won't say safe, I'll say comfortable. Yeah, I don't want to be in that world.
A big reason why we are working together at Symposia is trying to have our little meager flag waving so that people know that there are other people in the psychedelic community besides these corporate, entrepreneurial actors. And because I would not feel comfortable working with those people, like I would feel out of place and not, you know, in my element. And, you know, this is something we haven't even talked about before, but I feel like there's a lot to be said about the fact that a lot of us come from very disadvantaged, poor backgrounds. And I think that class insight puts us in a different perspective than the people who are working for North Star and these organizations who just honestly come from a different class experience and so have a different worldview. You know, it's like we don't share those assumptions and those views of what we should be kind of like aiming to do. And so, you know, part of it, so just talking about the game A, game B situation, like I feel like a way that I would like to reframe it and just kind of like, you know, moving forward, you know, what can we take away from this? I would like to reframe it as like right now, yeah, we are creating a culture that does fetishize and kind of like glamorize these, you know, predator jaguar types. And so we can kind of, you know, work to create spaces and communities where collaboration of the kind that Symposia, you know, works on is the, you know, the thing that we're prioritizing, A, and B, understanding that there are always going to be narcissistic, empathy deficient individuals, whether by, you know, biology or upbringing, that we need to account for in these spaces. And we can't just do that by pledging to do well. You know, we need to put systems in place that protect people, especially vulnerable people, from exploitation by narcissistic types, and especially, you know, even in therapy contexts.
I mean, that's why, like, when you wrapped up your video with, I'm really hoping that I say this right, but it's Anand Giridharadas.
Something, yeah, Giridharadas I've heard, but something like that, yeah. So
I'm trying.
Yeah. So he does this really great. He's written Winners Take All. He has this really great takedown of the whole vision of entrepreneurial change.
Right. I mean, I don't know. I just thought that was a really perfect way to respond and to put in conversation what I think you did a great job of establishing were elite narratives for, you know, collective deliverance or whatever. And he puts it like it's like arsonists showing up and saying, you know, hey, we're the firemen, and in fact complaining that nobody's, you know, doing a good job and that this is all fucked, and
and they're not being celebrated enough for their putting
Can't you
the
see
fire
what
out.
I'm trying to do for you here?
Well, and this ties directly into the sort of pharmaceutical psychedelic narratives that we're seeing about mental health and the need for mental health care. And when we actually look at the drug development pipelines and how much public funding goes into producing medicines in general that then gets privatized and sold back to us. I mean, these strategies of socializing costs and privatizing profits, right? Or underfunding social services and saying, well, these social services don't work, so we need to privatize them and we'll step in and save it. But it's like, y'all are the people who've been funding the lobbyists who are advocating for the defunding on the front end of that, right? And we have these intentionally misrepresented relationships between or about the effects of the actions that we're seeing in the world from these people. And the reality is they only call it class war when we fight back. You know, there's analysis of the fact that so much of what certain people refer to as conspiracy in some senses is really just as Giridharadas points out, it's upper class folks acting in class solidarity. There are, this is why we need to acknowledge these interests. This is why we need to have systemic critique and an ability to point to the structural realities of capitalism, of industrial civilization. Because the notion that anything that we've currently got as far as our industrial civilization is sustainable or can be sustainable, we just need to buy the right products. It's just bullshit, you know?
And that, by the way, the entrepreneurs are like a big part of Daniel Pinchbeck's class right now. That they like featured.
Those are mysticapreneurs.
Yeah, sorry, misread.
No, please go on. I'm sorry.
Sorry to interrupt you, Dave.
No. That's just it. That needs to be pulled apart. The notion that a mysticpreneur can say, oh, don't pay attention to all the costs associated with my endeavors. My heart's in the right place. that functions as this it's spiritual bypass, right?
Yeah.
It's I've done my inner work, so pay no
Mhm.
attention to the realities that are necessary for my venture to succeed.
Yeah,
Mhm.
just look at the stamp. Yeah. It's like the B Corp thing. Just they can hide in it. They just have a stamp.
Well, that's, I feel like real Game B is not letting the arsonists call the shots anymore. Like that's actually Game B, but that's not the way that these, IEW types are talking about it. And the fact that Anand had such a, precise response to their particular take shows how much these conversations, for all of their openness and radical free speech, they're actually very cloistered communities. They're actually not taking into consideration other perspectives, partially by, like you were saying about Jamie's comment, kind of dismissing the validity of anything that is not speaking the same language.
Well, and not even being willing to discuss on a point-by-point basis. And I know we're going to be wrapping up in a sec. So I'd just like to throw out there like an open invitation. In years of offering critical perspectives around psychedelics, society, capitalism, industrial civilization, I've frequently found that some of the critical perspectives I and we have put out have been talked around, have been vaguely gestured to by certain people. The points haven't been engaged with. And I'd like to extend an open invitation to any of the people we've brought up today, any of the groups we've brought up, if they're interested in actually having an open public discussion, debate, forum, salon, whatever, where we can document and have an open exchange of ideas, see where the discourse takes us, see what actually holds up when we put it through lenses of, critical engagement, analysis, an exchange of ideas and insights. I would be really curious to see where that goes. And I'm certainly willing to put my perspectives up on a point-by-point supported, hopefully well-supported basis. And let's go back and forth and see where things wind up. Now, I would say if people don't want to take that up, or if people want to continue speaking in vagaries or kind of pointing to a gestalt of what we're putting out there, I'd suggest there's a reason for that.
Hey, so I actually have a question, Nishay. If we're not to follow our, elite mystic gurus, and Game B is confusing at best, and perhaps not all of that satisfying at worst. Where should we be going with this? What do you think?
Well, I think it's not trying to get everyone on side, because I think some people just do have incompatible aims, and then working with the people, collaborating with mutual aid with the people who have the same aspirations, vision, interests, without there being this mediation of the psychedelic leaders and the psychedelic, underlings, like just the psychedelic community as a commons, I think needs to be emphasized as a virtue, and not just something that can be exploited by the psychedelic capitalists for their own ends. And then we've seen this, like where they're taking stuff that has been developed in the commons, frameworks and approaches, protocols, and then selling it to the highest bidder and to CEOs. Like that's going on, but we can just cultivate the commons. We can cultivate our community connections and really advance these dialogues, without trying to appease the CEO.
So quick follow-up. What do we do about the people who see the commons and community and conversations in those spaces as audiences to market to?
Ideological harm reduction. When people know what vampires do and how they do it, they're less likely to invite them in their house. Like that's, end of statement. That's like, it really works. It's fantastic. I recommend people go look at this Live Abuse Free YouTube channel, where she close reads people's behavior and shows the motivations that are kind of implicit in their words, their actions. And that's kind of, I was inspired by that close reading of behavior in my own video, trying to kind of distill the kind of metadata about the conversation, that's implied. So there's a lot of resources out there, and I think it's just a matter of educating ourselves and each other. And part of the reason that this isn't more widespread is because the sociopaths and narcissists have been so in charge for so long. gay may or whatever. You know, it's like, it's not in their interest to educate people at the elementary school level of this is how not to be abused, like, psychologically, intellectually, whatever. So if we focus on these skills and, you know, what to look for, how to protect yourself, how to establish healthy and maintain healthy communities and boundaries and all the rest, I think that we really do already have what we need.
I think that might be a really good place to end. I think we should definitely put the show in the show notes, the resources that you mentioned.
Yeah, I love any feedback, you know, conversation. If anyone else has any video or kind of wacky materials that, you know, you think we could work with, you know, please do send them in. Yeah, and just any thoughts would be appreciated.
All right. Well, thanks everyone.
Thanks.
And thank you, Nishay.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks,
seriously.
guys.